August the 8th, 1963, 15 men robbed the Glasgow to London mail train of £2.5 million, worth 30 million today. 2 days later, the press dubbed the crime the Great Train Robbery. And one of the most enduring news stories of the century was ready to roll. Over the next 36 years, the legend grew and grew. The robbers became national celebrities. There were books and movies galore. By the end, the robbery had turned into myth, a tale of super thieves thwarted only by the devilish ingenuity of a band of super detectives. But tonight, we tell a very different story, of how both robbers and police were anything but the stuff of legend, and how myth has obscured a catalogue of bungling, betrayal, and corruption. Bridego Bridge, 12 miles from Aylesbury, is the head of Buckinghamshire CID, Malcolm Futrell.
All we knew at that stage was that the high-value packet coach of the train had been attacked. About 120 mail bags containing an unidentifiable amount of money had been stolen, and it was something quite unheard of. About 1,400 yards further away were 10 coaches containing about 70 postmen, all busily sorting their letters. No idea at all that a crime had been committed.
My first impression was, when I heard some details about it, I was amazed. Over £2 million in cash, and the way they'd done it, I mean, it was like a Jesse James saga, you know.
Like Jesse James, the Great Train Robbery would enter folklore.
I thought at 3 o'clock in the morning to know how to uncouple a train, you can see they must have done their homework well and truly, and the timing of it was excellent. This is why the public took to them and made them folk heroes almost.
As the years passed, it became in the interests of all involved to fuel the Great Train Robbery legend. Movie makers in need of big audiences, journalists wanting a good story, policemen writing their memoirs, and of course the robbers themselves. The legend has come to be told like this. First, a glamorous gang, led by the most daring thief of his day, carrying out the perfect military-style operation. The legend continues with the entry of the most feared detective of his day, head of the flying squad, Tommy Butler. The stage is set for the ultimate cops and robbers showdown. The police swoop on the robbers' abandoned hideout. With brilliant detective work, Butler pulls them in one by one. 10 of the gang are brought to trial, and the judiciary does its bit to build the legend by handing down the longest ever sentences for robbery in Britain, 30 years. In the public eye, the robbers now become the victims. With nothing to lose, they begin to escape from prison. First, Charlie Wilson. Then, in July 1965, Ronnie Biggs. The country is brought to a halt in the search for them, but the public are now behind their heroes, every inch of the way.
Whose side are you instinctively on, the escaped man or the police?
On the escaped man, I think. I'd like to encourage the police, but I think the escape, I'd like him to have a good run for his money.
Well, in so many regards, one thinks jolly good luck. One again is speaking loosely, and let's hope the police are not watching.
Buster Edwards and Bruce Reynolds go on the run, living the high life in Mexico. Back in Britain, the legend reaches new heights when the Chief Constable of Durham, Alec Muir, claims that one robber, Gordon Goody, might use nuclear weapons to escape from prison. Muir is not the only one living in train robbery fantasy land. The Prime Minister himself, Harold Wilson, devises a cunning and top-secret plan. As these documents show, Wilson suggests foiling the robbers by reissuing every UK banknote, making the train robbery money worthless. But in December 1965, the plan is quietly dropped by the Treasury as being too costly. By the end of 1968, all the robbers bar one have been brought to justice. Only Ronnie Biggs slips the net. To this day, Britain's most famous fugitive lives out his days on the sun-drenched beaches of Brazil. And here ends the legend of the Great Train Robbery. A brilliant crime performed by slick, good-looking criminals, undone only by the dogged detective work of Scotland Yard's finest. But take apart the legend piece by piece, and the truth becomes more complex, more unpleasant, and less heroic. Every great crime legend must begin with a mastermind leading a brilliantly organized gang. And from the outset, the press was determined that the Great Train Robbery would be no exception.
With the Great Train Robbers, there was always a sense that there was a Mr. Big behind it all. Some sort of eminence grise who were spending their time thinking, how can we fool the police in lots of different ways?
But far from being a glamorous criminal mastermind, the originator of the train robbery was a solicitor's clerk called Brian Field. And Field would become the legendary gang's first big flaw. He'd become tempted by a one-off criminal coup when a friend told him about the huge sums of money carried on the Glasgow to Euston Royal Mail train. Field's friend was also no Mr. Big. He just happened to have a brother who worked on the train. Field started hawking the idea of robbing it around London's underworld. One man he contacted was South London gang leader Fred Foreman.
At that time, there was a lot of talk about the train robbery, and the work was being bandied about a little bit. That Brian Field approached several people, and I was approached myself about it, but I didn't really fancy it too much.
Field's final choice of partner was one of his best clients, safe blower and armed robber Gordon Goody.
I spent Christmas with him, and we used to go out socially. And he mentioned to me one day, he asked me if I was interested in going to work again. And I said, well, yes, of course. And he told me the story about a friend of his who had this information. Consequently, I met the friend, and we went on from there.
Goody took Field's information back to his gang. Jewel thief Buster Edwards, armed robber Charlie Wilson, Formula 3 racing star Roy James, and their chief planner, Bruce Reynolds. The gang's biggest coup so far was a daring robbery at Heathrow Airport. They dressed up as city businessmen and walked off with over £60,000 worth of wages. The planning and disguises caught the public mood, and the press lapped it up, naming them the Bowler Hat Gang. But when it came to trains, the gang was not so clever. They'd made their first attempt to rob one on the London-Swindon line. It was a fiasco.
The communication cord was pulled. I heard Buster say the train's not fucking stopping. And with that, he then applied a guard's brake, which brought the train to a halt approximately half a mile past where we should be.
The Bowler Hat Gang realized they needed advice on how to stop a train. Buster Edwards turned to a friend, Tommy Wisby, member of another gang called the South Coast Raiders.
Well, we was already doing a few trains, at the time. We was doing the Brighton line. So consequently, he asked me if we could get Roger for him. So I said I could, but we got to find out through Roger if he would do it.
Roger was Roger Caudry, famous in the underworld as a technical genius who knew how to stop a train. But his method was hardly rocket science.
My 3-year-old daughter could have done it equally as well as Roger Caudry. He got a glove and placed it over the green light. He got a battery, maybe 2 batteries and 2 wires, and he hot-wired up the red light to come on. Isn't that complicated? Thus did the train stop.
But Caudry was a star turn. The South Coast Raiders' price for providing him was a place on the robbery for Wisby himself and 2 other gang members. Now Bruce Reynolds decided that as well as a train stopper, he needed a stand-in train driver. He paid a visit to a friend, a low-grade thief called Ronnie Biggs, who was now trying to go straight and was working as a carpenter.
I had 2 children and I was happily married. And as it happened, I was working for a train driver by the name of Peter in Red Hill, and I was changing the front windows of a bungalow.
He told me that he actually knew a train driver, and in response to my inquiries, he said, well, if you've got sort of something going, I think he could be talked to about it.
And I spoke to the old train driver, and I said to him, what would you do for £40,000? And he said, oh, I would do anything for that kind of money.
I explained to Ronnie that there was no need for him to be involved, that there was £50,000 in it for him without doing anything except for an introduction to the driver.
But by coming along, there was the prospect of making much more. Biggs joined the gang, along with the retired train driver, Peter.
Peter was extremely naive. And I remember one incident when the old boy said, nice vehicles, these Land Rover, who does this belong to? And so Jimmy White, who was driving, he said, don't know, Dad, we nicked it the night before last in the Strand. And the old boy said, nicked it? Christ, you go to prison for a thing like that.
A gang that had begun with the sophistication of the bowler hats was, with the arrival of Biggs and the old train driver, rapidly degenerating. It was also getting too large. During the late 60s, Norman Parker got to know most of the train robbers in prison.
The danger with something like the train robbery was this: it was such a hallmark robbery, a one-off robbery, that anyone who'd been told anything at all about it, when the actual robbery did go off, there was a likelihood of them talking to other people, and then the police getting to hear about it.
It was too widely spread around the news, in the grapevine, in the underworld.
The majority of the robbers weren't heavy-duty armed robbers. There were a few who were, I suppose you could certainly say Charlie Wilson and Gordon Goody, had a track record of heavy-duty armed robbery. But the rest was a sort of a pick-and-mix concoction of lesser criminals, minor criminals, and even a couple of straight goers. It was a very, what we call an odd mark firm.
On August the 8th, 1963, the odd mark firm prepared for action. But within just 12 hours, an informer, whose name we will reveal, would give most of their names to the police. As the Royal Mail train hurtled through the night, the great train robbery gang lay in wait. But their elderly replacement train driver was hardly displaying the professionalism of legend.
All of a sudden he whipped out his pipe and lit the pipe up, and a big flame appeared, and Charlie Wilson threw himself over the track with his mask on and everything, and said, what the fuck's going on? And the old man said, hello Charlie. And Charlie said, have a look at him, Ron, you'd think he's on his bloody holidays, wouldn't you?
Just after 3 a.m, the mail train was in range. Bruce Reynolds' self-styled commando operation swung into action.
You can hear the hum when it's in the distance. Immediately I identified it. I immediately called through on walkie-talkie to Paddy at the Dwarf, and I repeated it 3 times. This is it, this is it, this is it.
In response to the red light engineered by the robbers, the mail train's driver, Jack Mills, brought the train to a halt. But straight away, the gang committed a huge blunder.
One person, his job was to cop for the driver, and by cop for the driver that means the guy was 16 stone. He had to just put his arms around him and say, be quiet, Pop, you're all right. The person that should have got hold of him didn't, because he wasn't a particular regular member. He didn't know all the teamwork, etc. In other words, he could have been just a bit slower. And someone else who again wasn't part of the regular, he took the matters in his own hand and hit him from behind.
Jack Mills was hit by an iron cosh. He further injured himself as he fell onto the footplate. Mill's injury forever cast a shadow over the train robbers' legend, and ever since, many of them have tried to dismiss it.
He had a whack on the head. It's unfortunate. But take it from me, Mills's injuries were not as bad as the press made out and the judges and everyone made out.
I know he got hit, and I know, it was one of them unfortunate things, but he never got hurt as much as they said.
Well, I went to see Jack Mills in hospital immediately. He was in a very bad state, being attended by a doctor and nurses, and obviously they wouldn't have been wasting their time on him had he not been badly injured. And of course it was suggested by Buster Edwards at some time that Mills was pretending that he wasn't badly hurt at all. That is ridiculous. He was badly hurt.
He got shingles, which the doctor said was delayed shock coming out. And then from then on, his right hand shook. It never stopped till the day he died. And he started to sway. He just went, it was terrible. He just, from that day, he went downhill. He was not my dad of old.
With Mills injured, Ronnie Biggs, retired driver, was summoned to drive to the unloading point. But the bungling continued.
Up jumps the driver, who's been brought along by Biggs. Unfortunately, in the 2 years since he left British Rail, they put a new handbrake on the train, and he couldn't find it. He couldn't release the handbrake. The train robbery almost came to a halt then.
The injured Mills was forced back into the driver's seat. Luckily for the robbers, he was fit enough to drive on. The unloading began.
Charlie Wilson was the first one aboard, but the train stopped, and I think there were about 7 people in the train at the time, and Charlie growled at them and threatened them with the axe, and they all laid down. And the carriage doors were open, and they started passing the money down through like a chain system to the truck.
The robbers returned to their base, Leatherslade Farm, 28 miles from Bridego Bridge. They began to count the money.
When they had reached £1 million, everyone was invited down to look at it. And Charlie Wilson was dancing the twist and saying, I like it, I like it. Gordon Goody was singing, It's the Good Life. And I say that the general euphoria touched us all, I imagine.
As counting went on through the night, Gordon Goody went upstairs to act as lookout.
It's boring when you're counting money. I hate counting money. And listening to the police calls, and that's when it came over the radio. And one said to another man, you're not going to believe this. He said, they just nicked the fucking train.
The robbers thought they'd won. But Leatherslade would turn into a disaster area. The gang had planned to go to ground there for several weeks. Then, 2 days after the robbery, Malcolm Futrell held a press conference.
At the scene, one of the gang said as they left, don't move for half an hour. So I disclosed to the press that we were going to search a half an hour from Bridego Bridge. The press took it up wholeheartedly and splashed this, and they said not half an hour, they transferred that to a 30-mile radius. It so happened that at the time Leatherslade Farm was 28 miles from Bridego Bridge.
That was no place to be when that happened. And so we just sort of split them straight away.
The robbers abandoned the farm. They claimed they took care not to leave evidence like fingerprints lying around.
We all had our jobs. As I say, I done as me and someone else doing the bathroom, had all the taps running and everything. Was in the nude, like cleaned it all down. Still had the gloves on.
But in addition to their own hurried clean-up, the robbers believed that arrangements had been made to get rid of everything which linked them to the farm. Most of them say this was the responsibility of the solicitor's clerk, Brian Field.
Apparently that was what he was paid for to do. it was going to be done, it ain't going to be done, it's going to be done. You know, every time someone phoned up, how's the dustman been? Yeah, it's coming today, but it never got done.
They didn't think Leatherslade Farm would ever be associated with the train robbery.
Two days after the abandoning of Leatherslade, the police made their first arrests. The train stopper, Roger Caudry, was captured in Bournemouth with a friend, Bill Bow. But this was the product of chance rather than police cunning.
Roger Caudry just happened to be unlucky that he had rented a garage from, happened to be a policewoman's widow who for some reason thought he had a lot of money when he paid for the rent for the garage, and she phoned up the police.
Caudry was interrogated by Detective Sergeant Jack Slipper of the Flying Squad. It soon became apparent that he had something to hide.
Suddenly Caudry became very uneasy sitting in the chair, and he was moving from one cheek to another, and eventually said, "Look, you better get your police doctor in." He said, "I've got an ignition key of the car up my behind," he said, "and it's getting very uncomfortable." And they had to do a necessary extraction.
The ignition key, extracted from Caudry's behind, led the police to a Ford Anglia in a Bournemouth car park. It contained £140,000 of train robbery cash. The same day, 5 days after the robbery, the police found Leatherslade Farm. They trumpeted their discovery, but once again no great sleuthing had been required. A local farmer had led them to it.
There were all these mailbags, some empty, but a lot filled with wrappings. We found about £800 in 10-shilling notes. I don't think they wanted those for some reason. And 3 vehicles, 2 Land Rovers, oddly enough, each with the same index number, a lorry which had been half painted yellow, and all this material inside the house. And, of course, fingerprints. For professional, dedicated criminals to leave the evidence behind that they did was incredible.
There was an added twist to the gang's bungling. The solicitor's clerk, Brian Field, had not only failed to get the farm cleaned up, he'd left a paper trail which would lead the police straight back to him.
Brian Field actually used his own firm to act on the purchase of Leatherslade Farm. Now, if Brian Field had anticipated the farm was going to be found, I'm quite sure the last thing he would have done was use his own firm. Because the first thing the police were going to do, once they'd found Leatherslade Farm and found that it had changed hands recently, is go to the solicitors and say, "Who was your purchaser?" That's exactly what they did.
With the net closing around him, Field lost his nerve. 7 days after the robbery, his money was found in an abandoned case by a couple walking in woods near Dorking.
There was some kind of build-up of earth and debris, and perched on the top of this was this beautiful suitcase. It wasn't an ordinary suitcase, it was a lovely embossed suitcase. And in the bottom was found a bill from a German hotel made out to Mr. and Mrs. Brian Field.
He was a nice enough guy, Brian, but from a criminal point of view, totally naive. He had a sort of hail fellow well-met persona. I think he thought it all was very much a jolly game. And I suppose, but amongst the criminal fraternity, we've got a name for that sort of person, and we call them a silly bollocks.
Brian Field began to get the heebie-jeebies, but all the rest of them, all of their lives, were professional criminals, and they didn't have the intelligence. Even Reynolds didn't have the intelligence to say, what I must do is to make sure that for that period of time between the 6th and the 10th of August, I'm going to be somewhere else completely different. At least that'll be my alibi and substantiated by fairly credible witnesses. But they didn't do that. It's unfortunate, from their point of view.
But the robbers did not just have themselves to blame. From the very beginning, Tommy Butler had seemed to know exactly who the train robbers were, and began pulling them in one by one. His pinpoint targeting has always aroused suspicion among the robbers and throughout the underworld.
All the people on my firm and around me never got a tug. They never got pulled in. You know, they only pulled in the people who were really involved, you know, which was very strange.
Talking to them in the years immediately afterwards, most of them gradually admitted that they believed there was some sort of an informant. They weren't quite sure who.
Somebody had been seen coming out of Scotland Yard. Charlie was onto it. I don't know who it was, I don't know how it was, but Charlie was convinced that it was somebody who put the names up.
Tonight we can reveal that within 12 hours of the robbery, the police had an active underworld informant. We can also reveal who it was. The informant was run by the head of Scotland Yard's Intelligence Division, John Cummings.
Information came from a source known to me as Mickey, who supplied 5 or 6 names of persons that he said had taken part in the great train robbery. Mickey named Hussey, Wisby, Charlie Wilson, Welch, Reynolds and Daly. So we had those 6, and of those 6 we mostly had dossiers on them. So we knew what to do, where to go, put observation on their addresses straight away.
All those 6 went on the run. Eventually only John Daly was acquitted of the robbery. John Cummings is not prepared to give the full name of his underworld informant, but we've discovered that it was an armed robber of the 1960s and 70s called Mickey Kehoe. Today the train robbers and their friends say it's impossible that Kehoe could have betrayed them.
Mickey Kehoe? No, complete rubbish. I knew Mickey Kehoe very well, and he was never. He was a pavement artist like the rest of us, and they even called him he had a nickname as being the Kosh Boy, and he would never have come up with that business, Mickey Kehoe. No, he was a terrific guy, lovely guy.
Mickey Kehoe, no, I know Mickey Kehoe. Right? Mickey Kehoe, I met Mickey Kehoe in a special unit, you know, and I didn't know him beforehand. I'm sure that none of the other trained people knew him. He just happened to be in a unit in Parkhurst where I was, and no, he couldn't be an informant because he didn't know us. He didn't know us.
But as we have shown, the identities of the train robbers were well known on the underworld grapevine. And another 1960s criminal, John McVicker, believes that Kehoe informed on him about an armed robbery they carried out together for which McVicker was convicted, while Kehoe, though arrested, was never charged.
Kehoe led a charmed life as a criminal, and invariably when people do, there's something going on behind the scenes, and what's going on behind the scenes is they're feeding names of what they know and people they work with for a licence for their own activities. And looking Kehoe in the round and his character and the type of man he was, I think it's reasonable. It may not be beyond a reasonable doubt, but on the balance of probabilities, I would say that Kehoe was a long-term informant. He informed on me, and almost certainly, if he was informing on me and my little gang, he would have thrown in what he knew about the train robbery.
Mickey was himself an armed robber. He committed crimes, big crimes. He and I had some sort of affinity. We got to trust each other, and Mickey was very, very useful to me when I was in C11. And the one redeeming feature about him was that if he told you anything, it was accurate, it was true, you were not wasting your time.
Mickey had already supplied the names of the leading robbers. Then, just 2 days after the robbery, Mickey gave further priceless information to John Cummings.
On Saturday, Mickey got in touch with me again and I met him, and he was able to tell me that the train robbers were in fact on a farm within half an hour's travel from where the crime was committed, but if action was to be taken, it was to be taken quickly because they intended to leave the farm the next day.
Mickey's information came just after the Buckinghamshire Police press conference, announcing that they were going to search an area within 30 miles of the robbery. Ironically, that had alerted the robbers to leave the farm the next day. But the investigating team still had a small window of opportunity. Cummings contacted Malcolm Futrell, head of Buck's CID.
We gave him the information, but unfortunately, apparently, to a lack of manpower and resources, at that stage he was unable to act upon it, which personally I found very disappointed, because I thought a more positive action may have resulted in a spectacular result within 3 days of the crime being committed.
Malcolm Futrell confirms that the information was conveyed to him, but he believes that it came too late. Whether or not a real opportunity was missed, Tommy Butler was disappointed to have been deprived of the ultimate coup.
When he came up first of all to Aylesbury and he said, "Take me to the farm," and I took him to Leatherslade, and he looked all around at this place, and there was all the tin cups and the mugs and things of that kind, and the plates and their beds and so on, and he looked at this and shook his head, and he said, "What a pity, Nipper. Only just a few more weeks and a few more days and we could have nicked them here. But never mind, we'll get the bastards."
Get the bastards was what Butler set out to do. But was his evidence all it should have been? The great train robbery investigation has gone down in history as a textbook piece of detective work. But if Tommy Butler, the head of the flying squad, couldn't get the evidence he needed, was he prepared to make it up? One piece of the prosecution case was successfully challenged at the time. This was the so-called confession by Charlie Wilson, taken down by 2 of Butler's officers. The fabrication of such confessions by the police was then so common that it was given a name: verbaling.
Verbaling in the early 60s was rife. Hardly a criminal case went by when there wasn't some suggestion that police had made up evidence. Now, the verbal put into Charlie Wilson's mouth became quite a famous one. He was alleged to have said at the police station to 2 police officers, "You may have got me, but you won't find the poppy." Poppy being slang for money.
It's not a term we'd ever used before, and subsequently they found out that this was one of Butler's pet pieces of verbal. It went back 30 years that he'd been using this verbal.
John Matthew successfully argued that the police had fabricated Wilson's confession. But was any of the fingerprint evidence fabricated too?
I thought all the evidence that was found at the farm was manufactured. The government thought at the time that we were a threat to society in particular, and they gave Chief Inspector Butler virtually carte blanche. Do what you've got to do, but these men have got to be arrested and they've got to be put down as an example to the others.
Fingerprints were found on a bathtub and kitchen utensils, the rear wing of a truck, and, most famously, on a Monopoly set with which the robbers had played at the farm. Unlike his fellow robbers, Ronnie Biggs is prepared to concede that much of the evidence was solid.
The prints on the Monopoly set were people who had played. Me and Johnny Daly and Charlie Wilson and whatever.
However, there's genuine doubt about some yellow paint found on a truck at Leatherslade Farm, which was used to convict Gordon Goody. Goody had long been one of Butler's most coveted targets. He recalls Butler's delight when he finally found some evidence to charge him with.
He had a parcel in his hand, say a parcel, it was some brown paper. And he said to me, "Are these your shoes?" And he opened the paper like that, and I said, "Let me have a look." He said, "Don't worry about that, don't worry about looking." He said, "You're nicked." And that was it. So I was nicked. And then afterwards I found out that there was paint on the shoes.
The police said Goody had stepped into some paint which had been spilt on the floor of the garage at Leatherslade Farm. They matched the paint on the shoe to paint found on the clutch pedal of a Jeep used in the robbery. However, no paint was found on the carpet beneath the Jeep's clutch. Goody says this is inconsistent, as he would have had to have rested his foot on that carpet.
I was never at all happy about that evidence. The thickness of the paint, as we discovered at a later stage, on Gordon's shoes was exactly the thickness of a brushstroke.
They fitted me up. I'll make no bones about it. I was a train robber. I was there. But the evidence against me was not correct. The evidence to me was 100% false.
But police forensic scientist Dr. Ian Holden, who examined the paint on Goody's shoes, believes a fit-up would have been very hard to achieve.
First of all, you would have to have the liquid paint, and by the time the farm was visited by the investigating officers, I should think the paint was probably dry. So you'd have to have the liquid paint, you'd have to put it on in such a manner as to make it appear that it had been trodden on. And secondly, you would then have to contaminate it on the surface with the mineral material that was on the floor of the garage. And then you would have to wear them for a considerable time to wear the paint off in the manner that I saw it.
The same yellow paint was used to convict Bill Bowl, the friend of Roger Caudry, who had been arrested with him in Bournemouth 5 days after the robbery. Police said they found the paint on a watch winder in the lining of Bowl's jacket. The prosecution claimed in court that this proved Bowl had been at Leatherslade Farm and was part of the robbery. However, the robbers are unanimous that Bowl was not.
He wasn't even there. He was after the event, you know, and they knew this. I mean, they actually fitted him up to put him there, you know. I mean, that's true. That's coming from me. You know what I mean?
He had nothing whatsoever to do with the robbery as far as I'm concerned, before or afterwards. I state quite categorically that he was innocent. He'd never been to the farm at any particular time. There's no way that he could have had that brass knob in his pocket with that identical paint on it. So one has to deduce that someone put it there.
On this evidence, Bowl was convicted of conspiracy to rob the Royal Mail and sentenced to 24 years in prison. However, in addition to the robbers, the policemen we interviewed believe there are oddities about Bowl's conviction.
I'm quite satisfied, I've always been satisfied, that Bowl was never at the scene of the robbery or never was at Leatherslade Farm.
He certainly, in my opinion now, wouldn't have been one of the chaps actually on the robbery. As time goes on and you speak to people who have been involved, I'm quite satisfied that he wasn't involved.
A year later, Bill Bowl's sentence was reduced on appeal to 14 years, but the charge of conspiracy to rob was upheld. Bowl died after 7 years in prison, still protesting his innocence.
Bill Bowl went away with Roger Caudry, probably knowing full well that Caudry had been involved in the train robbery, because Caudry was flashing around large sums of money, and where else would he have got it from? And that's the crime that he committed. So I suppose he could have been done for dishonestly handling stolen property, and probably in those days, in the nature of things, would have got a sentence of 3 or 4 years. Yes, it was a gross miscarriage of justice.
That yellow paint put him at the farm. The same paint that was on my shoes, they done that to him. They should never have done that to this guy, because he's a straight guy, you know. It's a tragedy what happened to that man. It should never have happened. Should never have happened, you know.
The 10 robbers who came to trial in January 1964 were given the longest sentences ever awarded for robbery in Britain. Police, lawyers, and the robbers themselves were astonished.
I mean, 15 years was a big sentence in those days. We were expecting 18 to 20. If it had been any less than that, it would have been considered really quite lenient, I think. But 30 was way out. And we were all quite shocked, actually, at the time. Nobody had ever heard of a sentence like that. in those days.
They just wanted to lock us up, you know. They know. I didn't know. They didn't know what to do with us, you know, 30 years. You know, they wasn't geared up for it. All they wanted to do is bag us up in a cell, put the light on 24 hours a day, you know.
The coshing of the train driver Jack Mills was used to justify the sentences. But the man who attacked Mills wasn't even in court to hear them read out.
The biggest upset was, and we put it that way, that the man who hit the driver, we think, we've been told by very good sources, has never been charged.
3 men, and obviously I can't name them, 3 men who we strongly suspected, in fact we're almost certain had been involved, were involved. We had no evidence at all.
The identities of these 3 men, who are all still living, are well known in the underworld. But we have new evidence as to why 2 of them may have got off. This evidence goes to the heart of one of the great mysteries of the investigation. On December the 3rd, 1963, £50,000 of robbery money suddenly appeared at a telephone box in London. Malcolm Futrell and his Buckinghamshire team were mystified.
We saw an evening paper billboard, train robbery, £50,000 recovered. And we thought, well, that's odd. Why don't we know something about this, you see? Obviously a deal had taken place because somebody had arranged for this money to be there, had told the police. Now, how somebody knew it was £50,000, I never fathomed.
Somebody knew because an extraordinary deal had been done. The 2 players in this deal were South London gangland boss, Fred Foreman, and the number 2 in Scotland Yard's flying squad, Frank Williams, who was Tommy Butler's deputy on the robbery investigation.
I had a good relationship with Frank Williams over the years, and he trusted me and I trusted him.
Foreman had first met Williams in the mid-50s, when he was running his gang from his pub in Southwark, and Williams was a local detective. Their friendship was viewed by other policemen with great suspicion.
I thought that Frank Williams, for example, was far too close and too much involved with Freddie Foreman. It was what I would call a very unhealthy relationship.
He wouldn't say he could do something if he couldn't. He'd say, I can do that, but I can't do this. And you knew how you stood with the man, you know.
Foreman claims that the £50,000 in the phone box was part of a deal he negotiated between a train robber, who has never been charged, and Frank Williams.
The only way they could get a conviction was to fabricate evidence, you know. So to leave him alone and to let him get on with his life, I was approached as an intermediate with Williams and arranged for the money to be exchanged. Frank asked for £10,000 to be put on top, to be dropped off bookmakers in South London on their way after the pickup. And the person who they suspected was left alone, which rightly so. That was the deal. That's what's supposed to happen. And touch wood, to this day, that's how it stands.
According to Foreman, the £10,000 was intended as a reward for the middlemen who'd arranged the deal. But all the press coverage had made things too hot, and Williams ended up handing all the money in. Foreman goes on to claim he did a similar deal for another robber.
That's when I took the money to the station in Nunhead, just around the corner from my betting shop, and 2 holdalls for £50,000. And he was in a flap, Frank Williams, when he had a driver with him in the car, but he was in a complete flap. He said, I can't take it, it's gone wrong.
According to Foreman, Williams was initially prepared to collect the money, but on the unexpected return of his boss, Tommy Butler, he decided it was too great a risk and backed out at the last minute.
He said, you'll have to take it back. Can I escort you, till I get see that you get back safely with it, with the money? And I said, no. I said, no problem, I'll take the money back. No, don't worry, no problem. So I'll just trudged off with the 2 Carib holdalls, and that was the end of that one. But the person, they couldn't convict the person, even though they suspected him, because there was no evidence, unless they concocted the evidence.
The men who got away could still be charged today. Their fellow train robbers have kept their identities secret for 36 years.
I can't say anything about them. And I wouldn't say anything about them. They escaped prosecution, as you say, but good luck to them. And I'm sure that they appreciate our silence. And that's good enough for us, you know, it's good enough for me anyway.
Altogether, 3 robbers, plus the train driver brought in by Ronnie Biggs and the original informant on the mail train, were never caught. But for the rest, whether on the run or in prison, the robbery would turn sour as they became the robbed.
You know, you got to rely on other people. You ain't got the purse strings, have you? You know, you got to rely on what they do. You know, which wasn't all that clever. You know, they had good intentions, but they, you know, it's not their money, is it?
That's the old story, out of sight, out of mind, mate. You know, they're all friends there when at the time, and you know, but as soon as you're out of the way, you know, and they think, well, I need to go. I'm going to the dogs tonight. I haven't got a lot of money. Oh, I think I'll have a few quid out of the bag, you know, and that's what. And you use best friends. You lose friends with money.
To many, this is the final image of the great train robbery. Glamorous settings where glamorous criminals live out their days on the profits of the glamour crime of the century. The truth is harsher.
Well, it's almost as if there was a curse on them. I mean, Brian Field came out, he changed his name. 10 years later, he's driving home one weekend, a car comes from the other direction, hits the central reservation, flies in the air, turns upside down, lands on top of his Porsche, killing him and his wife.
Then there's Charlie Wilson, murdered in Spain by 2 hitmen in a row over a drugs deal. Buster Edwards, who was arrested for shoplifting. He ended up hanging himself. And Roy James, the one-time racing driver. He had a serious heart operation and then took part in a medical trial.
He died during the tests, during the trials, so it does become a very, very tragic tale when they come out of prison.
My kids and my wife are suffering until today. My wife still comes to see me, but it ruined any chance we might have had of living together.
The whole idea of being in Rio, in Copacabana Beach, like sipping pina coladas with bikini-covered girls, it's a marvellous way of life. But of course, that's one side of the coin, and then you've got the other side of the coin where everyone done 12 years in prison. I mean, the total sentences were over 300 years, and whatever you've got out of it, you've paid for. There's no free lunches in this world.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please join our Facebook group. It's called Krays Crime Lords of London. We're a friendly moderated group with over 1,000 Kray and other celebrated gangster videos available for view. There's also thousands of images in the photos sections. The link for the group is in the YouTube description section. I hope we see you there soon.
Leave a like and subscribe.